Hello, everyone. Welcome to our workshop. The topic today is understanding and untangling ADHD and trauma. I've got Kerry Hackman who will run this webinar for us, and she's prepared like some great slides. And I think you'll run about 50 minutes, like you'll be talking, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. So Kerry is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in somatic therapy for trauma, and she has ADHD herself. So I'll let Kerry lead this workshop and introduce herself. And just to say that throughout this workshop, feel free to put any questions that pops into your head into the chat box, and I'll monitor the chat box so we can ask these questions at the end. All right, Kerry, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Sam. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Understanding and Untangling ADHD and Trauma. My name is Kerry. Okay, hold on. Seeing if this will advance my slide. Let me just try one other.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. We have to use that button there. Okay. So a little bit about myself. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I'm a therapist working in Seattle, Washington, USA. I've been in private practice for 4 years. And before that, I spent 11 years working with students with disabilities in high school and college, which in the UK is, I know, referred to as secondary school and university. I've trained in somatic psychotherapy for 2 years. And like Sam said, I am a person who lives with ADHD and trauma. So I'm really excited to talk about this with you today. I also included a picture of my dog, Scooter. He is a 14-year-old boy. And I just include him because he's one of my biggest, he helps me with coping and grounding. And he's just a really special dog. All right, first things first, a small disclaimer. Talking or reading about trauma and certain topics can be difficult and may cause strong feelings and reactions. Please take care of yourself and be mindful as you participate in this training. And that this presentation is for educational purposes only and should not be used as mental health advice or be used for any mental health diagnosis or treatment, nor is the information a substitute for professional medical advice. Second, because learning about trauma can lead to a stress response in the nervous system, I do encourage folks to use fidget toys or scribbling or any other coping strategies that you have. I really liked this infographic of signs that you might need to take a break during the presentation. Maybe your thoughts are racing and overwhelming, you're having trouble sitting still. Maybe you're getting angry or frustrated. Focus becomes even more difficult than maybe it usually is. Heart racing. You're not really taking in the information and having to reread things. And biting nails, pulling hair, that type of thing, or if you're close to tears. So these are really just signs that you're having a nervous system response and might need to take a break. All right, so what are we going to cover today? We'll start with a little information on what is trauma, the co-occurrence of ADHD and trauma, and then we're really going to dig into the new neuroscience around ADHD and trauma. I'm going to share a little bit about somatic psychotherapy and what I do, and then what people can do if this is something that you experience, and ending with some self-compassion, because I think that's one of the most important things when dealing with these difficult challenges. So what is trauma? I think many clinicians might define this in different ways. The way I define it is any life event or experience that causes chronic and ongoing dysregulation in the nervous system. So it's really that trauma is not the event itself. Trauma is the response to the event. So if we can look at the flow chart, we have a distressing event. Sometimes, maybe even many times, we're able to process and regulate. Maybe we're able to connect with other people, and then we can kind of return to our baseline. But sometimes there's a distressing event, and maybe because it's too overwhelming or we don't have the right resources to process, then that can have a chronic impact on the nervous system. And really what ultimately happens if there is significant levels of distress or repeated distress, it causes the nervous system to remain in a survival state long after the danger has passed. And we're going to talk about that more later on. So what is the co-occurrence of ADHD and trauma? Studies do show that experiencing trauma increases a person's chances of being diagnosed with ADHD, and that in total, some 20 to 50% of children with a history of childhood trauma have clinical levels of ADHD. And you can see that study is from a while ago. This is not something that is studied very often, but I think we're getting more information on this. I really liked this graphic from the study that shows the total sample, and then we can see there is a subset of people who have ADHD, and then there's a subset of people who have trauma, and then there's this really significant overlap of ADHD and trauma. And then in a smaller amount of folks diagnosed with PTSD, which doesn't account for the significance of the trauma. It is only a very specific way that trauma can be expressed, a specific set of symptoms. And then an even smaller group of folks with ADHD and PTSD. So I think ultimately we don't necessarily have really great data on the percentages, but I think this diagram is likely what is happening. So here is a list of the shared symptoms of ADHD and trauma, and you can see that it is quite a few. Difficulty concentrating, poor memory, emotional dysregulation, restlessness, hypervigilance, which is that being alert all the time, interrupted sleep, impulsivity, problems connecting with others, and substance use. And so I think when it comes to these symptoms being expressed, it really is a chicken and egg situation, which is why I included the meme, because when these symptoms express themselves, it's kind of, we don't really know what came first. Why are these symptoms being expressed? Is it because of the ADHD? Is it because of the trauma? So why are these conditions, what's the connection? And I took a couple quotes from a doctor and a psychologist from some articles on Attitude Mag. And I'm just going to read them because I think they kind of start to explain what might be going on here. The connection between ADHD and trauma is likely rooted in toxic stress, the result of prolonged activation in the body's stress management system, that survival system. Both ADHD and trauma affect the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, which controls executive functioning skills and reasoning, and the amygdala, which is in your brainstem, which processes emotions. This can lead to hyperarousal or restlessness, difficulty with emotional regulation, all of the symptoms that we saw on the previous slide. So it often leads people to ask, like, is this ADHD? Is this trauma? Is this both? And the truth is that it's complicated. ADHD and trauma are different. You know, ADHD is a neurological condition, it's highly genetic, and people are born with ADHD. And then trauma is, you know, experiences that happen in folks' life also can be intergenerational. But what's really important to know is that childhood trauma can exacerbate the symptoms of ADHD. It can make them more intense. And ADHD itself can cause trauma or have lasting impacts on the nervous system because a lot of children growing up feeling like an outsider, being dismissed by adults, isolated from peers. And I think oftentimes there's this masking phenomenon of trying to pretend to be somebody that you're not. And doing that over and over consistently is sending the message that like you're not okay or you're not enough. And that can cause shame and lasting impacts on the nervous system. So I liked this tweet, a message I want to share with adults who work with ADHD kids is pushing them the way that you push neurotypical kids harms them for life. We really have to work with people with ADHD in different ways. I thought this dino comic really emphasized what we're talking about here. The little dino says, did you know that kids with ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages than their peers? And the big dino says, sounds like self-pity to me, and that's 20,001 negative messages. I think that's a fairly relatable experience. All right, so I want to show this video to introduce where we're going with this. And that is really to learn about the nervous system. These are both things that live in our body's nervous system. And this is something called the polyvagal theory, which many people might have heard of, but it's kind of about how the nervous system works and how these things get stored in the body and then expressed. So the video is about 4 minutes, so just bear with me on it because I think it's well done. It's also produced by a company called Unite ILS that I don't have any affiliation with. This is just for educational purposes, and I'll stop it before they start to talk about their program. So hopefully this works.
Safe, understanding our body's response to the world around us. Now more than ever, the world is a busy place filled with uncertainty. People of all ages, demographics, and geographies are struggling and suffering. Research and experience tell us that rapid societal change and adverse life experiences are increasingly resulting in physical and mental health challenges for huge parts of the global population. For some, it is visible. For others, it's more hidden and on the inside. While traditional treatments help some, many with adverse experiences or conditions such as ADHD, autism, or PTSD continue to struggle. This affects quality of life, both for individuals and their families. It can impact internally how we feel and think, and externally our ability to connect with others and the world around us. Ideally, we can respond effectively to life's challenges, respond versus react, replacing emotionally charged reactivity with controlled responsiveness and resilience. Access higher learning and cognition. Learn and retain important facts and concepts that enable greater confidence in societal contribution. Build positive social relationships. Develop relationships and truly connect with others. Scientific advancements have helped us better understand how the nervous system works and have given us greater insight into what's happening in the minds and bodies of those who struggle. Polyvagal theory, or the science of feeling safe, is one of these key research advancements that helps us better understand these challenges and gives us a foundational framework for non-invasive ways to support them. Developed by world-renowned researcher and Unite's chief scientific advisor, Dr. Stephen Porges, polyvagal theory focuses on what is happening in the body and the nervous system and explains how our sense of safety or danger or threat can impact our behavior. Understanding polyvagal theory gives us a scientific framework that can be applied through physiological or bottom-up therapies to help change and improve how we feel, think, and connect with others. Our brain and nervous system are constantly taking in information from the world around us, helping us to assess if we are safe or in danger. This is called neuroception. Every input is assessed through this lens: what we see, what we hear, and what we experience. A soothing voice, an unexpected sound, or unwelcome situation. Our body senses it, takes it all in, and responds automatically. Our autonomic nervous system has 3 key states and is controlled by the body's largest cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, that stretches from the brainstem to the colon. It's the control center for how our body processes the signals and cues from the world around us, and in turn, for how our bodies react. Parasympathetic ventral vagal state, our calm state or true self, where all social engagement, connection, and cognition occurs. Sympathetic state, feeling of threat or danger, and having the desire to either fight or flee from a situation to seek safety. Dorsal vagal state, our free state, when we feel our lives are so immediately threatened that we become immobilized. So much of our behavior is reactive based on these constant cues and signals. Our nervous system is constantly making decisions on our behalf and letting us know if we are safe or in danger. Often, especially for those who are struggling, our system misinterprets these cues and presents a danger response when in reality, no real danger is present. We all process cues and signals from the world around us differently. Some of us struggle with this more than others, based on our genetic makeup and life experiences. This is especially true of those who experience the effects of trauma, or with conditions such as ADHD, autism, or PTSD. Stimulating the vagus nerve and providing cues of safety can enable our nervous system to reset and change our physiological state, helping us to more easily access our parasympathetic state and to more consistently feel safe and calm. At Unite and ILS, we develop bottom-up.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Okay. So you might recall this image from the video of the vagus nerve. It's this largest nerve in our body that runs all the way from our brainstem all the way down to our tailbone. And if you can see this yellow nerve kind of going through the lungs, the diaphragm, the heart, the liver, stomach, all the way into the gut, you know, that's why many of the experience of feeling dysregulated is happening in the sensations of our body as racing heart rate or shallow breath, a lot of GI issues. And then if we can see also that the vagus nerve is connected to the facial nerves, and this is how we socially engage with others, is through these facial muscles, and that's that social engagement state, that ventral vagal state. And so we have access to those facial nerves when we're in that ventral vagal. So this is a little bit of a new paradigm in trauma neuroscience. Prior to this, it was really believed that we had kind of a survival state, a sympathetic state, and that was the fight or flight response. And then we had the parasympathetic state, and that was rest and digest, and the body kind of went in between these two states. And now, according to the polyvagal theory, we know there's this sympathetic response, this sympathetic activation in the nervous system, which is the fight or flight response. I'm going to talk a little bit about the vagal brake later. And then we have this parasympathetic response, but that has multiple branches. So that has the dorsal vagal immobilization or freeze state, the ventral vagal, the social engagement, kind of that optimal neural state. And then we also have the dorsal vagal rest, and this is what we need to enter into in order to go to sleep. So I think about dorsal vagal freeze as being in the dorsal vagal state with fear, whereas the dorsal vagal rest is being in the dorsal vagal state with calm. And a lot of folks with ADHD have a lot of difficulty with sleep and a lot of interrupted sleep, and that's because it's very difficult to enter into that dorsal vagal calm when your nervous system tends to be very activated. This is another graphic just to kind of help talk through these kind of complex systems that are happening within the body. So we see at the bottom, there's that social engagement. This is where we experience joy, feeling grounded, feeling curious, open. And then right above that, we see this squiggly line. And that's really kind of what we want to experience in life. Is we're not going to stay in the ventral vagal state all the time. There are going to be things that make us nervous. There's going to be things that are that cause suffering. And so it's kind of this movement, into the sympathetic, back into the ventral vagal, into the sympathetic, back into the ventral vagal. But in folks with chronic dysregulation, there's a lot more of this big curve happening. And you can see this big curve leaves the ventral vagal, goes into the sympathetic arousal. If it is combined with that fear, anxiety, that's going to be kind of more the flight response. The fight response is kind of more that anger, rage. And then that dotted line you see that's the vagal break. That's the point where if we can recognize that we are in that sympathetic activation, and we can use one of our neural state strategies to help us move back to social engagement, that's where you can see that deactivation and return. But if we miss it, as we often do, we can kind of go up and then kind of fall down into the dorsal vagal freeze state. And that's where folks experience kind of depression, shame, lives in the dorsal vagal space, shutdown, hopelessness. And then it's just more of a challenge because we have to upregulate to deregulate. And I'll talk a little more about that as well. But I think it's important to understand that we move through these states many, many times a day, and they can be as short as seconds. So it's not always kind of this very intense situation as shown here. It's kind of more to a greater and lesser degree moving through all these neural states. Okay, so I thought now might be a good time to take just a little pause, enjoy some funny memes. I thought this one was very relatable. Just to kind of check in with your own nervous system and recognize what's going on there. Maybe you need to take a little drink of water. Maybe you need to stand up and stretch a little or stretch your arms just to kind of check in with yourself. This was another meme that I thought was very relatable. It's for folks with ADHD. Do you have motivation? No. And then no, but in red. I definitely relate to that. All right, so shifting gears a little bit into treatment. So how do we treat ADHD and trauma, and how do we treat both? These are some of the traditional treatments for ADHD and trauma. For ADHD, we know there's talk therapy, cognitive therapies, behavioral coaching, psychoeducation. I think is incredibly important. The more we can learn about ADHD, the more we can manage it. We know medication is a big part of treatment with ADHD. For trauma, very similar. There's talk therapy and cognitive therapies that can be very effective. Somatic and body-based psychotherapy, which is what I will be talking to you about, and that's what I do. And you may have heard of something called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's the EMDR treatment. And this treatment is based on the idea that a lot of trauma is stored in the muscles of the eyes. And if you can process the trauma while doing these very specific eye movements, that can help release and transform the trauma in the body and regulate the nervous system. There's a ton of research happening right now with psychedelics for trauma treatment, a lot of really promising stuff coming out that can be like a shorter term treatment. because sometimes trauma treatment tends to be very long and it's a very challenging thing to work through. So some of this psychedelic medicine is helping people find relief in a shorter amount of time. And also medication is used to treat trauma. So for folks who have both ADHD and trauma, like how do we find the right fit? And I do think it's important, if possible, to find a clinician who understands ADHD outside the very narrow perspective that most clinicians are trained in. And then I really think trauma treatment needs to be provided by somebody who has been trained in trauma treatment to avoid re-traumatization and other things. So I do think that this is a kind of sometimes a rare specialty to find. And I do think having a clinician who's trained in trauma, sometimes I would hope most clinicians would be open to learning more about ADHD. So sometimes it might be helpful to kind of bring articles or bring information to the therapist so they can understand the new information and the new learning that we have about ADHD. So what is somatic psychotherapy? Sometimes I think this gets confused with like hands-on, like touch therapy from like a body worker. And there are some body workers who are trained in somatics, but this is really, similar to traditional therapy. It's, it does not use physical touch, but it is just kind of a different way of being in the therapeutic relationship. So the focus is on this bottom up processing versus top down processing. So top down processing is like a cognitive therapy where you are kind of processing cognitively in order to feel better in the body. And bottom up processing is tuning into the sensations of the body, working to regulate those sensations, and then noticing how that impacts cognitive functioning. So it's working in a different way. I think both ways are effective. I just think with the bottom up processing, it can be maybe a little bit stickier because the body is really learning how to regulate. So it's just important to have both of these available. So what else is somatic psychotherapy? It's really learning how to better recognize and interact with the different neural states of the body. So we learned a little bit about the three main neural states of the body: the ventral vagal, the sympathetic activation, and the dorsal vagal. So it's really learning in my own unique body, what do those different neural states feel like, and how can I know what to do if I notice that I am outside of my optimal state. And I emphasize unique because everybody is going to feel these different neural states differently. Some folks might get really sweaty if they're in sympathetic activation. Some folks might notice it more in their heart rate. So it's really learning that unique expression in your own nervous system. And then it's learning grounding or movement techniques in order to help return to the ventral vagal. And why is, somatics therapy something that could be helpful for somebody who has co-occurring ADHD and trauma? I think about it as bringing in the edges. So we remember from that graphic kind of that squiggly line and that big line. So it's about learning emotional regulation so that we can have less of the extremes. You often hear folks with ADHD talking about all or nothing thoughts or behaviors. So this is helping people with ADHD access that gray area. I often think of especially inattentive ADHD folks as really living above the shoulders, spending kind of a lot of time in rumination or a lot of active thinking. So this is really helping people with ADHD bring their awareness below their shoulders and into the body to just kind of give a bigger container for all those wonderful creative thoughts. Helping folks with ADHD learning how to co-regulate with another person. Because we often know with ADHD, it's very difficult to self-regulate that emotional dysregulation. So sometimes we need another person to help us learn how to self-regulate. And then outside of the therapy experience, you can use some of those strategies with self-regulation. And so somatic therapy is not going to cure ADHD, but I do think it allows better access to the strategies and interventions for ADHD. A lot of folks with ADHD spend a lot of time learning systems, learning ways to help them function. But if somebody's in a lot of dysregulation, they're not able to access those strategies and interventions. So it's really allowing kind of a more efficient way to access those strategies. So sharing a little bit about what an actual somatic session looks like, and I often say it's really difficult to describe unless you have the experience of this. And there's also different ways of working somatically. There's different methodologies, different modalities. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the way that I work. So the first few sessions are often focused on resourcing, and resourcing are these tools to help the nervous system regulate. I'm going to share some potential resources a little later on, but it's really emphasizing that we need these anchors, because if we leave optimal arousal, we really need to know how to get back, because inevitably when we're processing trauma, we are going to leave our ventral vagal. And I might start off with a mindfulness exercise or something to help people relax, to start from that place of regulation. Very important to start from a place of regulation. Then, we kind of go into a little bit of talk therapy, and a client might describe something stressful from the week or a negative belief they have about themselves, something about a relationship dynamic that they'd like to work on. And through that, we bring awareness to the body, and we ask guided questions to help understand the sensations that a person is feeling. So they might notice that they're feeling a really intense vibration in their chest, or they might have they might feel collapsed or really like some nausea in the stomach. And so we really attune to those sensations and use different resources, maybe like movement or grounding, to help regain that regulation. And we might go back and forth through that exercise throughout the session, kind of continuing to process what's coming up and how those neural states are shifting during the session. And then hopefully at the end, arriving at a place of regulation to re-examine the event or the relationship. And you often find that folks have new insights, or they now have access to that creative problem solving that people with ADHD are so known for, and can look at things in a different way. So I really think that this information here is really important to remember, and if it could kind of be one of the takeaways. It was created by Dr. Bruce Perry. You might have heard of him. He wrote a book with Oprah called What Happened to You? And it really is this process of noticing a neural state, using grounding to regulate, having that connection and validation with another that whatever you were experiencing was real and true and important. And then it gives us access to our reasoning, our problem solving, our reflection, and we can really see it's like a complete transformation from the beginning to the end. So oftentimes we try to do this in reverse. We try to reason our way into feeling better. We try to think our way into regulating the body. And we really want to start thinking about it as feeling our way into more regulated thinking. So it's kind of the opposite of what might be the tendency. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about down-regulating and up-regulating. And I chose this image of a stoplight with the green in the center, because I think it's a good representation of what I'm trying to describe. So if we think of the green in the center as that ventral vagal optimal state, and we think of the yellow as that sympathetic activation, and we think of the red as the dorsal vagal freeze. When we notice we are in sympathetic activation, we're in this yellow, we need to down regulate, we need to slow down, and we need to move our nervous system down. When we notice we're in the freeze, we need to up regulate and we need to move up. So just kind of imagining that as I'm moving forward. Grounding and down regulating for folks with ADHD. I use the graphic here of what ADHD is like. It's kind of this constant spinning. It can be very activated, very adrenaline fueled way of being. And so one of the most important things to learn is something called grounding. And this is fostering the connection with the earth, fostering the connection with the ground. It's physically feeling your flat feet on the ground or your sit bones on a chair or your back on a chair. This helps down regulate the nervous system and move all that activated energy downward. Sometimes if it's hard to access, I encourage people to just physically sit on the ground, move your body downward. Oftentimes with ADHD, folks try to meditate. Meditating is a wonderful grounding and down-regulating exercise. However, it is incredibly difficult for folks with ADHD who have very busy thoughts, and expecting somebody to sit with those thoughts can be really activating. It can have the opposite effect. So getting creative with it. What is a meditative activity for you? Is it maybe a walking or scribbling or creating art or writing or baking or whatever kind of is that thing that puts you in that flow state? We know that people with ADHD can access that flow state, and that can be a very meditative process. Another incredibly helpful down-regulating activity is breath work. But again, like meditation, I always encourage folks to proceed with caution, because that vagus nerve goes right through those lungs. And sometimes when people try to pay attention to the breath, it has the opposite effect and causes folks to become more activated. So a really kind of simple framework I encourage is trying to make your out breath a little bit longer than your in breath. This sends a signal to the nervous system that you are not in danger. There is no life-threatening experience happening right now, because if there was, you wouldn't be able to pay attention to the breath and make sure that your out breath was longer than your in breath. Orienting to the space, just using all the senses, any sense that you have access to. So being able to see what's around you, or tuning into the sounds, tuning into any smells or tastes, or, a lot of tactile touch is really good for ADHD, having that fidget toy, having that tactile sensation on your hands can be regulating. A lot of folks use weighted blankets. Sometimes, again, it's up to the individual, but that compression, that gentle compression, releases good chemicals in the body and can be regulating. Another way to trick the body into slowing down, similar with breath work, is if you just slow down your speech, slow down how fast you're talking. And I always love to practice this because I can really feel that when I slow down my speech, I can just feel my body slowing down. And you can do similar things with movement, just slow, rhythmic movements. And finally, kind of using warmth and cool. If your nervous system activation comes from feeling really sweaty or really hot, a cool drink of water, ice pack, or if kind of sometimes in that freeze state, we get really, really cold. So bringing warmth, like a hot water bottle, hot tea, just helps kind of encourage the nervous system to move into that regulated space. All right, so what about activating and upregulating for ADHD? I chose this graphic. Hey, I'm an owl. Instead of doing homework, stare at me until your leg falls asleep. I think feeling stuck and feeling frozen is a very common occurrence for folks with ADHD. So one thing that I do, and again, these resources need to be so individualized, but I just share it because I found it and it's fairly effective for myself, is I have a get up and go playlist on my phone. I just put it on shuffle, and whatever song comes up, they're all upbeat. They are, high energy songs. And it's one of the only things that can kind of get me to get going and get moving if I'm finding myself frozen on the couch or in bed. Imagery in nature is so helpful for both upregulating and downregulating, but I put it here because I think things like the sunshine is very activating and upregulating for folks. Physical movement. So if we think of frozen, we think of, okay, we got to get the body moving. But this doesn't mean exercise. It can if exercise is beneficial for folks, but it really can just mean just a gentle rocking or a gentle moving your finger. Another strategy I really like for that kind of frozen stuckness is noticing the resistance and then considering smaller and smaller steps until you can feel the resistance diminishing in your body. So I use the example of doing the dishes. So there's this huge pile of dishes in the sink and it feels crushing to have to go and deal with this huge pile of dishes. So, okay, we know there's a lot of resistance there. What if you only had to do half the dishes? No, that's still very crushing. I can't do half the dishes. What about one dish, just so you have a dish to eat with? That might even be too much resistance. So even, okay, could I just stand up, or could I just do my gentle rocking? Whatever the lowest amount of resistance is, and then trying to move forward from there. And then one of the most efficient ways to that ventral vagal as an activating and upregulating practice is connecting with a pet or a safe person. That is something that really moves us directly into that ventral vagal state. Listening to your body and honoring its signals is one of the true forms of self-love. I genuinely believe this. I genuinely think honoring yourself and what your body is telling you is really a way you can show yourself that you're taking care of yourself and honoring yourself. Okay, so spending some time on how to cultivate self-compassion. I think self-compassion is such an important part of having challenges in your life. I think sometimes with ADHD, folks try to strong arm their way through life. They think, well, if I just try harder tomorrow, or if I just get everything perfect and all my systems set up perfectly, then I can, move forward. And really, that's a signal that you need a break. Like, you need to give yourself a break, because we really need to love ourselves through life. And that's having self-compassion is how we kind of create the life that we want. The strong arm is going to counteract that. And the reality is, folks with ADHD and folks with trauma need a lot of downtime, and that's a reality. So the more you can understand that and provide that for yourself, the more you can cultivate that self-compassion. Learning the beauty of being a square peg in a round hole world, learning your unique differences and the strengths that you have, developing this sense of self with ADHD and trauma, okay, these are part of who I am. And then finding others in that community, like finding others who can help you feel like you belong, is such a big part of this process of regulating. I think learning and implementing boundaries could be an entire presentation in itself. But I think it's just a really important thing to be part of your ongoing practice of, how do I know my limits, and how do I not breeze past my limits because I want people to like me, or I want to please others. Like, really, how do I know what's best for me and then live into it? And developing a relationship with a therapist, if that's possible for you, because that's a person who can hold compassion for you when you can't hold it for yourself. And I say everything in this presentation knowing that these things are not easy. These things are incredibly difficult. And cultivating self-compassion is probably one of the most difficult things to do. So having somebody there to help support you in that is wonderful if you can have access to that. I created a brief journaling exercise, not something that we need to take space to do right now, but maybe something that you can screenshot and come back to later, is really thinking about what are your unique neural state resources? What are the things that make you feel calm and grounded? What is that thing, person, connection, that place in nature? And then doing something called amplifying it. So now that we have that thing, how can we create a representation of it? So a color, an image, a sound, a word, so that we can return to that feeling as much as possible. And just a short word on resources. Don't try to do this alone. This is really tough stuff. So organizations like ADHD Girls, I encourage most of my folks with ADHD to sign up for the mailing list for Attitude Mag, just because they seem to have a really good handle on the diversity of experiences that people with ADHD have. They don't just look at it in one way, they look at it in all the different ways. You can meet other people in online groups, of course, proceed with caution. In-person support groups, if that's available in your area and feels safe for you. Podcasts and books. I actually think folks with ADHD know many more resources than I do, but these are just a couple that I listen to and I think are beneficial. All right, so we do have a little bit of time for questions.
Yep.